as we celebrate the potential of girls with slogans like, "The future is female and girls run the world," there seems to be a growing chorus of, "What about our boys?" Raising sons in the 21st century is complicated. Journalist Rachel Giese is editor-at-large at Chatelaine magazine, and she explores what it's like for boys to grow up in a culture that expects them to behave like boys and then penalizes them for it in her new book, Boys, What It Means to Become a Man. And we're pleased to welcome Rachel to our studio tonight. Hi.
Hi, how are you?
I'm so happy to finally meet you.
Oh, I know, I'm happy to meet you too, finally in
But
person.
you know, reading your book, a few times I broke down in tears, but then I also realized I have all these blind spots when it comes to boys, and I'm raising a son.
Yeah.
So you're the editor-at-large with Chatelaine, and I'm assuming you're a feminist.
Yes.
So why write a book about boys?
Well, because I have one. So part of it is my experience. I'm married to a woman, and we adopted a son almost 14 years ago. And we didn't give too much thought to gender at the beginning. We were caught up in the throes of early parenthood, and you know, I had this strong feminist analysis, and I was watching my friends who were raising girls and navigating the world of like pink princesses and Barbies, and how do you build strong young women who resist gender norms and gender labels that hold them back. And I began to think about what it meant for my son and the stereotypes about boys and males, that they be aggressive, that they find status through having lots of money or dominating other boys and dominating other girls, that boys don't cry, they don't have access to their emotions. And I wanted to look at the ways in which those stereotypes that we have about boys cause them harm to themselves and cause them to do harm to others.
And you give us a lot to think about in the book, but there's one incident that happens that you observe your son doing, and I was wondering if you could read the section from your book.
For sure.
And then we'll talk about it afterwards.
Sure. So this came after seeing my son one day meet a friend on the street, and they were about 10, and they did the very elaborate, they gave daps, they did the very elaborate handshake with one another. And so this is what I write. The glimpse I had of my son giving dap to his friend made me stop short. When had he become such a guy, I wondered. And now that he was older, how would his transition from boy to man alter him? I began to more seriously consider the ambient noise of gender rules and masculinity, the lessons both implicit and overt that my son was absorbing about male culture and manhood. What did he think it meant to be a man? Was manliness for him simply about endearing and benign rituals like complicated handshakes and a fondness for guy stuff like basketball and Call of Duty? Or was he also picking up on the more troubled and troubling manifestations of masculinity, such as aggression and emotional detachment?
It is a tricky time to not only be a boy, but to raise a boy. Did you and your wife ever have a conversation about how you would raise your son?
Yeah, I mean, I think we've had many conversations about this, and we've had many conversations about, you know, the things we wanted to expose him to, and so, you know, making sure that the pop culture he consumed had a variety of images of men and masculinity, making sure that the men he had in his life provided a lot of variations on what it means to be a man. So, you know, I'm white, my wife is white, our son is Indigenous, and so we wanted to make sure that he had lots of men in his life who were men of color, gay, trans men, that he also understood that women didn't adhere to a particular kind of femaleness or femininity. So we really wanted him to understand that there wasn't a set. The world might tell him there was a set way to be a man, and the world might have all kinds of biases and projections on him as a male and as an Indigenous male, and we wanted him to understand that he didn't have to abide by those rules, and he didn't have to see himself through that lens.
Did you ever worry about him not having like a father in the home? You tell this funny story about McDonald's.
Yeah, I mean, I think at first, and you know, our son, you know, does tick a lot of the traditional male boxes. So he is a little jock, and he likes video games, and he has a very big physicality. So in many ways, he fits the kind of traditional, like when you think of a boy, he kind of fits that traditional model. And one day I was thinking about this, and I said to him, you know, do you ever miss not having a dad? I know you have lots of men in your life, but do you ever miss having a dad? And he thought about it, and he said, you know, I think if I had a dad, and I was like waiting, like what was he going to say? And he said, I think I'd go to McDonald's more often. And then I kind of challenged him and said, you know, but no, we have a friend who's a vegan, they don't go to McDonald's, and there's a friend who's like super into the environment and they don't go to McDonald's. He's like, oh, and he was like already like just bored of this conversation. And he said, you know, I don't know about that. All I know is that you two lesbians never take me to McDonald's. And that's kind of how our son has found his path. Like, he's very funny. And so like a lot of our conversations with him about this stuff is like being humorous about it, and to talk about these norms and rules as having like a real weight and a real material weight. But there's also like to also realize how absurd it is to think that you know, only boys can play hockey, or, you know, only girls can wear dresses. I mean, there's something absurd in these rules that we've made up.
Even like coming down to color of clothing. My son will not wear a pink t-shirt, and I'm a feminist, and he says to me he won't wear it because it's a girl's color. But in the book, you explain that these ideas of what it means to be a boy and what it means to be a girl is actually, there's a historical context to it.
Yeah.
So where do these ideas come from?
Yeah, I mean, I think that even terms like masculinity and femininity are culturally specific, and they don't adhere from culture to culture, from, you know, nation to nation, even throughout history. So, you know, the color pink used to be a boy's color because it was a derivative of red, which is seen as a really strong, powerful color. And blue used to be a girl's color because it was the color of the Virgin Mary's robe, so it was seen as a color of purity. And at some point, due to marketing, due to, you know, trends changing, suddenly pink became for girls and blue became for boys. And these rules, which seem hard and fast, you know, a lot of them are down to marketing. I mean, there was a period of time in the 70s, you know, in sort of that wave of feminism when you know, marketers were much more androgynous in how they marketed things. So you'd actually see there's been academics who've looked at ads for Sears and the way that toys were marketed. And there was a period of time when they were very gendered, and then there was a period of time when there would be, in the 70s, when there would be ads showing boys playing with dolls or girls playing with trucks. And then I think it coincided with the kind of backlash to that wave of feminism in the 80s and 90s. There was a retrenching of gender roles. And so suddenly there was Lego for boys and dolls and Barbie for girls. And so a lot of this, the things that we think are normal, and, you know, as a parent, I think often people will say, like, you know, we didn't do anything. Our son just started playing with trucks, or our daughter just played with Barbies. And there may well be some just personal preferences, but I think the messages come so hard and so early about girls' things and boys' things. And I'm sure you've had the experience shopping for your own kids. When you go into stores, you can't just buy jeans. There are girl jeans and boys jeans, and the girl jeans have like rhinestones and butterflies, and the
girl shorts are like,
exactly,
like
tiny little, they show off their
things,
bums, and they're sexy, and the boy shorts are down to the knees, and they're surfer shorts. So very early on, even buying bedding for a baby, it's like hearts and angels or trucks and dinosaurs. So we give these messages to kids super early.
What does that do to kids?
I think it makes them, because I think the kids, they're like little scientists. They're trying to figure out the world and its rules. And so I think for them, they learn really quickly that, you know, they start around 2, they start to get a sense of there being of gender. They look at the world around them and see that people are divided up in certain ways. And so I think what they begin to see, if what they see around them are, there are only things that people I understand to be female do and wear and look like, and there's only things that males do, then if they don't fit those norms, I think it could become very confusing and very hard and very limiting. And then often kids who do fit those norms begin to police other kids. So what happens is, you know, kids will tell each other, well, you can't, you're a boy, you can't go and play with the girls because boys don't play with girls, boys play with boys. And so you start sort of setting up, heightening a difference that really isn't there.
What happens to kids who are non-binary or kids who are trans?
Yeah, I think it could be incredibly painful for kids who feel like they don't fit. And I think that you then start having kids who are being forced to use a washroom that doesn't feel comfortable for them to use, or forced to wear clothes that don't fit them. And it leads to all kinds of a distorted sense of self. It also leads to bullying. I think if adults don't step in and support those kids, then I think those kids can have a sense that they're they're wrong, or the world, that the world, there's no place for them in the world.
Well, you read about this really interesting thing called the man box. What is the man box?
The man box is it's a term that's been used by sociologists for about a decade or so to talk about the set of traditional attributes of masculinity. So if you think about the traditional dude, the traditional sort of manly man, so being aggressive, being a breadwinner, being heterosexual, being physically strong, liking sports, being emotionally stoic, having power over women, liking things like technology and cars, those sorts of things is the man box. It's sort of a set of rules, and to be a real man, you have to adhere to the rules of the man box. And the reason why it's been given the box label is because it is a limiting thing, and it's also an almost impossible thing for any boy or man to live up to at any given time.
Well, you read about this incident where boys are asked, how do you see yourself? Can you tell me about that?
Yeah, so a friend of mine, Jeff Pereira, who I interview in the book, who does a lot of work around gender politics and gender issues, he had done a workshop with boys who I think were in grade 4 or 5, and asked them, what were the good and bad parts about being boys? And it was a pretty heartbreaking list. So when they said, how do you feel about being a boy? And they said things like, boys are supposed to be violent. Boys don't get to be mothers. Boys aren't allowed to cry. And so having kids that young who are saying, first of all, the mother thing is interesting because they're not getting told about the value of being a father, that they can have that role as a nurturer. They assume that is only something a mother can do. And then also that they feel that to be a boy means to be violent, that is what's expected of them.
And how young were these boys?
These were like 9 or 10. They were little. And so I think that boys are getting these messages, and then you can see where this goes. So if a boy doesn't fit that, so boys are striving to fit these rules of being a male, and those rules are not rules for having to be a healthy person, to be aggressive, to be violent. And I think these are some of the values that we tell boys they're supposed to be. But then we're also at a moment where we're talking about issues like consent and harassment. So if we say to boys, to be a real man is to be aggressive, never to take no for an answer, to be dismissive of girls, to seek status, to not be cooperative, to not show your emotions, you can see how that then leads to the kind of behavior we've been talking to as part of the Me Too movement, which is not recognizing someone's boundaries, thinking that women's bodies belong to you, thinking that it's okay to harass women, thinking it's okay to be a bully, because those are the attributes we say it is to be a real man and to be a boy.
I want to come back to the consent conversation, but right now I want to show you a clip of actor Justin Baldoni giving a TED Talk about what it means to be a man.
I can tell you right now that it is exhausting trying to be man enough for everyone all the time. Why does my dad to this day still think he's got to do it all on his own? I know men who would rather die than tell another man that they're hurting. But it's not because we're just all like strong, silent types. It's not. A lot of us men are really good at making friends and talking, just not about anything real. If it's about work or sports or politics or women, we have no problem sharing our opinions. But if it's about our insecurities or our struggles, our fear of failure, then it's almost like we become paralyzed.
How are men conditioned to suppress any show of emotion?
I think, it's become a bit of a cliche, the boys don't cry thing, but I think it's really true. I think that very early on, there's been research showing that, parents don't respond to boys' cries as readily as babies. Boy babies' cries as readily as they respond to girl baby cries. So right from the start, there's an assumption that, boys shouldn't show weakness, or their feelings, their tenderness should be dismissed. It should be, stifled and shut down. And so, those expressions like boys don't cry or man up suggest to boys that having vulnerability and having moments of weakness or moments of failure are inconsistent with male identity. And I think boys get those messages, and then they also, I think it's changing now with men that are in their 20s and 30s and early 40s, but I think they're looking around and the role models they have of other men are, you know, as Justin Baldoni says in that clip, men who don't talk about intimate things with one another, men who turn to women in their lives to talk about intimate things, to talk about their feelings, but aren't leaning on other men for that kind of emotional support. So I think that, you know, boys begin to pick up the message that I can't rely on other men to feed me emotionally. The way I need to be around other men is to be tough and to be strong and to never ask for help. And you know, that then leads to issues like, you know, depression and loneliness and isolation and boys not learning to be strong and equal emotional partners with the people in their lives.
I want to show you another clip, and this is from the actor Terry Crews on how some of the things that he was exposed to as a father.
I look at videos of the way I used to speak to my family. And I have, my oldest daughter is 27 years old. I have 5 kids, 27, 23, 16, 11, and 9. The 9-year-old's a boy. The first 2, I mean, I couldn't believe the way I spoke to him. I was like, shut up, shut up. I treated her like she wasn't human.
Terry Crews wrote a book called Manhood, and in it, he was trying to examine how he behaves as a man, not only in society, but towards his family. And then obviously I did the interview for a couple of years ago. But where does this form of toxic masculinity come from?
I mean, I think it comes from, you know, those messages, the man box messages, and then also I think, you know, a broader culture misogyny and sexism that devalues women, that sees women not as actors and agents but as objects for men and boys, and I think also sees men and women as being, you know, in an adversarial relationship or as opposites of one another. So if you say that to be a man means to be opposite of everything associated with femaleness, and if we associate femaleness with tenderness, vulnerability, emotional, you know, being emotional, and that's its own limiting thing too. I think that we should also be associating femaleness with strength and aggression and ambition, all those things, but we're talking about sort of traditional rules. So if you say, this is what it means to be female, it's soft, it's tender, it's emotional, it's weak, and to be a man means to be opposite that, then you have this form of masculinity that belittles anything to do with women, sees women as not having value, sees women as not being equals, whether it's as partners or in the workplace, and also sees women as a prize, as something that they get as a reward, as something that they're entitled to. And so, you know, you have in that plays out in very overt acts like, you know, rape and harassment, and it also plays out in things that are, you know, maybe not as large, but I think as annoying, like catcalls. So, you know, a man calling out to a woman on the street as though she should pay attention to him because he wants her attention. And I think that's also about signaling to other men, look at me, like I'm showing you what a real man I am. So when you combine the idea that women are less than, and that to be a man you have to adhere to these really rigid things, there's not many places for men to go, right? I mean, they can't show their emotions, they can't be tender, they can't be equal partners. It doesn't leave them with a lot of options, except in many cases to act out in toxic ways. In toxic ways.
And you know, if men and boys are getting negative messaging about their masculinity, one place where it seems to be affirming for them is online and social media, in groups where men are being told, there's nothing wrong with you, it's the women that are a problem. What role does social media and these kind of communities, what role do they play?
Yeah, I mean, they take something, like they take this weakness, this loneliness, this vulnerability, and this resentment, and they amplify it. So you're right. So instead of saying to you know, men and boys, wow, it sounds like you need some help. It sounds like you should go and find a counselor or a support group, or it sounds like you seem super angry that you've been rejected by women. Like maybe you should figure out like why you feel so angry instead of feeling disappointed, or like to have some self-awareness. Why do you feel that women owe you attention? Instead, various forums on Reddit or the kind of the manosphere, the men's rights activists or the pickup artists. instead of offering, like you said, instead of saying to young men, you know, be accountable, be thoughtful, get some emotional counseling if that's what you need, they're saying, you're right, the world is to blame. You're owed everything. You deserve this attention, and the world should pay for the fact that you aren't getting the attention. You aren't getting the attention that's owed to you as a man, and it becomes this sort of self-affirming, self-perpetuating kind of thing. So instead of actually looking around and thinking, how do I become a better person? It's like, no, I'm going to just feel really affirmed and supported in my rage and my anger and my resentment.
But also, too, how would they know that if we, because one of the things that I realized as a mother to a son, I have done things that I shouldn't do because I expect him, because he's a boy, and I also thought that I had the knowledge to not do that. So if we are, as a society, are treating our boys a certain way, how then could they know how to get help or how to communicate these feelings?
I mean, I think that's a really good question, and I think there are a lot of groups who are actually doing this work. And you know, when I wrote the book, people kept asking me, like, was I depressed? Because I mean, this is sort of, as I was writing it, it was sort of the rise of movements like Gamergate and sort of this activation of these online trolls that were going after women who were feminists in the video game world, or you know, the backlash we saw of the rising radical right in the U.S. and here in Canada. What I was able to do in the book was actually talk to a lot of people who were working with boys and young men in really positive ways, and letting them know, if you have feelings and you have struggles, it's not weak to find support. It's not weak to ask for help. It's not, you know, feminine or faggy to want to have a close friendship with another boy. And also, why would you think there's anything wrong with being female or feminine or gay anyway? So, you know, groups that are, you know, talking to young men, you know, holding them accountable for bad behavior, but also giving them space to talk about the ways in which they're struggling. And I think that those two things are so important that they exist in concert, because I feel like some of the online kind of toxic stuff is all about, come air your grievances, but we're not going to hold you accountable. And I feel like often boys can also get told, like, we're only going to hold you accountable, but we're not going to acknowledge your emotional selves. And I think there are ways that we can hold the two together, to acknowledge that, you know, it's up to us to teach boys to be decent and respectful and compassionate, and to be able to own their emotions, and also to say to boys, there's also an expectation that you be respectful of others, you respect other people's boundaries, that you don't just ignore the fact that as a male in society you get a certain amount of privilege. You recognize that, and you try to make the world better for other people, and you stand with other people. So, you know, there are a lot of you know, really terrific, thoughtful men, particularly guys in their 20s and 30s, who are not that far removed from the experiences of boys and young men growing up, who are setting an example for boys to be different, and giving them language, like to say to them, you know, why don't boys want to see the movie Frozen? Why do boys think that's a girl's movie? Or why do you think that, you know, boys have to always be tough? Or why do you think that, you know, girls are good at art and boys are good at math? Like, to kind of dig at those biases in ways that aren't, that are age appropriate, that aren't sort of telling boys you're bad and you're wrong, but also saying to them, like, don't pick up these messages in society. Right. Like, you can think more freely. You can be critical of the messages you're getting, and you can also choose a masculinity that's not the man box. You can choose a more expansive masculinity.
We're running out of time. I can't believe it. But no. I want to ask you two more questions. And one is about schools, because obviously our kids spend a lot of time at schools. What can schools do differently to maybe, instead of detention, to try different ways to not other boys, because boys are the ones that usually end up in detention, and you have the data in your book.
And not just boys, but in specifically racialized boys. And so I think there's a lot of implicit bias that's existing in school systems. So I think that, you know, teachers need to have, as part of their education, an understanding of racial bias and class bias as well as gender bias. So when they look at a room full of students, are they automatically assuming that some kids are going to be troublemakers and some kids are going to be gifted students? And I think the other part of it is to, make sure that kids are exposed to books and to readings that are inclusive and representative. I think it's also understanding that each kid learns in individual ways, and trying to have more individual approaches to children. And I also think it's not to, we've had in Ontario, we've had this zero tolerance policy in place, which has been softened a little, but it really throws kids out of school really quickly. So instead of looking at restorative justice, if a kid gets into a conflict, the penalties for it escalate very quickly, from suspensions to expulsions. And that just alienates kids from school. And I think we need to look at kids who are acting out, and to your point, most of them are boys, and try to get at, instead of pathologizing them or criminalizing them, to think about what's underneath this behavior. How do we take an opportunity to teach kids to not use violence or not use, bullying to deal with their struggles? How do we teach them to be more compassionate, to get along better with others, and to build that into the education system rather than immediately leaping to harsh disciplines? Yeah.
And the final question, you talk a lot about the importance of friendships. What can that do for our boys?
Oh, so much. I mean, part of it is loneliness. We know that boys crave closeness and intimacy, but because of these man box rules about intimacy between boys and between young men, often when they're in adolescence, they begin to have less intimate relationships with their friends. And that's exactly when boys experience higher rates of stress and depression. So friendship inoculates against mental health struggles. And positive friendships replaces the kind of toxic group actions, like bullying. Positive friendships actually, there's really good evidence to suggest that boys have a great deal of influence over one another. And so if you have a friend who's saying to you, don't be a jerk, don't talk to girls that way, don't be a bully, boys will, those peer relationships, they'll follow that. Those peer relationships have a ton of importance. So encouraging positive, loving, supportive friendships go a long way in teaching boys how to be good.
Rachel, thank you so much for being here and for writing this book.
Thank you.
It's such a great book, and it's going to help a lot of people, not who are just raising sons, but just in society in general. Thank you.
Thank you.
The Agenda with Steve Bacon is brought to you by the Chartered Professional Accountants of Ontario, helping businesses stay on the right side of change with strategic thinking, insightful decisions, and business leadership. Are you on the right side of change? Ask an Ontario CPA.